Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Björk Retrospective, the third episode in our Björk Retrospective series here on the Jams and Tea channel. And today we're talking about her seminal 1997 record, of course, Homogenic, one of her most beloved and critically acclaimed and well-known and well-regarded records, hot on the heels of her stellar sophomore record Post, which we talked about 2 weeks ago with Jakob, who's here with us again. We're also joined for this episode by regular podcast guest Connor, who I know is, spoiler alert, a pretty big fan of this record as well. And so we're going to talk about together what it is about this record in this particular era of Björk that's unique, especially compared to the music that came before it. The things that will have influenced Björk, the things that you can hear in this record as developments of her sound, and where we think this record sits in the ultimate arc of Björk as an artist. Unfortunately, though we're normally joined by Jake, who tries his best to be on every single video we make on this channel, Jake's not feeling up to it this week, so he has provided notes and thoughts for me to share as well. And his thoughts are quite interesting. I think we'll depart from some of what we think. So I will introduce those a little bit later on and we can discuss alternate perspectives. But for the most part, this is a record that means a lot to all three of us. It's a record that has been in my life since I was very, very young. And I'll sort of get into that, I guess, a little bit more when we start talking about our relationships with this album and how we kind of feel about it. But before we even get into any of that, I think we need to establish the context for this record. So we're telling the story of Björk's discography. We're telling the story of Björk's progression as an artist through this series. And so I think that it's fair to say that the lead up to Homogenic, which was released only 2 years after Post, is probably one of the most tumultuous lead ups to a Björk record. And it wasn't so much that the recording process itself was difficult, but it was deeply colored by the events surrounding Björk's stalker, Ricardo Lopez, a story that I'm not sure how familiar you two are with the story, but it's a very unfortunate story where Björk had a very obsessive fan by the name Ricardo Lopez, who I believe tried to mail some kind of device to her, essentially tried to kill her. A letter bomb, yeah, exactly. Essentially tried to send Björk a letter bomb that was fortunately intercepted before it reached her. But I think the reason why this story lingers so heavily in the public consciousness is that Ricardo actually recorded a video of himself committing suicide after doing this. I think he recorded a lot of video, and I think this was the nascent days of the internet as well. So there was this footage that existed of Ricardo's obsession. And I mean, if you've seen the footage, then one of the things that stands out about it, which is, it's very disturbing, obviously, but one of the things that stands out about it is that as he kills himself, he's listening to Post. And so this horrific event, which completely upset the process that Björk was in the middle of with trying to figure out where to go next, basically caused her to recalibrate a lot of what was happening artistically for her. She moved to Spain to record this record. It was very much an example of an artist isolating themselves. And also, one of the other things that's notable about it is that Björk ended her longtime collaboration with Nelly Hooper in the lead up to this record. And I think sort of started surrounding herself with newer voices and newer collaborators to try and sharpen her sound. The working title for this record was actually Homogeneous, which she later refined to Homogenic. And that was a reflection of the fact that, as we've discussed with Debut and Post, those are records that are so scattered with different sounds and different ideas and experimentations with different genres, and really expanding these vast possibilities of who Björk could be. Whereas with Homogenic, Björk was very clear about wanting to make a record that was much more single-minded, that had much more of a unified aesthetic, where each of the songs were unmistakably a part of the same fabric and the same record. And so for Björk, not only was this a departure in terms of the general atmosphere and mood and tonality, it was also a departure in terms of being more focused and singular in its approach than anything Björk had done up to this point. One of the things I think that had endeared Björk to the populace so much was that she was this hugely enigmatic figure who was so unpredictable. And that unpredictability certainly extends to the listening experience of Homogenic, but it is striking to listen to it and really feel as though Björk, at least from my perspective, Björk is more focused and dedicated than ever to the craft of the album experience, the craft of the singular, holistic, not necessarily narrative, although there is a sense with which you have this progression throughout the record that feels like it ends in a very distinct and meaningful place that I think is different from her previous two records, where the up and down, the ebb and flow, the distinct polarities of a record like Post are very much a part of that experience and make it unique and perhaps distinct from what we think of when we think of like typically crafted records. Even when we think about the idea of the female singer-songwriter going through their eras, right? Where every album represents a different vision of who this artist could be, a very distinct sound, a very distinct idea. I mean, we think about pop stars nowadays in the 2010s and 2020s, and the way they operate, the way they sell themselves is very much based around this idea of eras now, where each album brings with it this new evolution, this new vision, this new idea for who the artist could be. And while, of course, there were big pop stars that preceded Björk, big female pop stars that preceded Björk, I think that she's really one of the first to truly kind of stamp into the popular music consciousness this notion of eras for a solo artist. And I think Homogenic is really the album where she does that distinctly for the first time, because it's the album that represents the first dramatic shift for her. Even though, of course, you had those electronic influences and producers on Post, here it feels like you go from having those as kind of aesthetic decoration around these sorts of pop songs that could exist with or without them, to here they're such an integral fabric of every aspect of the musicality, of every aspect of the songwriting. One of the ways that you see Björk, I think, react against the increased media scrutiny that she was put under in the wake of her exploding popularity and the Ricardo Lopez incident is that Björk kind of refashions herself with this album. She's no longer this kind of young, wide-eyed, nubile figure who elicits this feeling of awe and radiates the sense of wonder. She's now this very kind of vicious and alien figure who has this like complexion and composure of metal and glass and feels utterly inhuman and distinct from this world, which is very, I think, meaningfully and potently depicted on the album cover, which is such a striking visual, right? And so along with this shift in sound for Björk, you have this idea of the era for a solo artist cemented with Björk, I think, making deliberate moves to shift the way that people think of her as a personality, to make people think of her in a maybe completely 180-degree different way than they might have before. And that, I think, is the groundwork that you have to lay to appreciate and understand where a record like Homogenic comes in and what Björk is trying to do with it. But I've talked heaps at this point. I want to hear from you guys now. What do you guys think about what I've said about how Björk kind of reinvents herself for this record and the aesthetic of how this record looks and sounds, and how do you respond to that?
It's super interesting how she went from debut and Post to this right here, because as you said, this is a lot more of a uniform sound than those albums, whereas Post, you have songs that are in the almost more industrial style, and then you even have like a jazz song on there, but they're all distinctly her, even with all these various styles. Whereas this album, it has its distinct moments. Like there are tracks like Pluto that doesn't really quite sound like anything else on the record, but I think this is where the sound palette for her album starts to become more uniform. And as you said, kind of about the era thing with a lot of pop stars, a lot of times we see that yeah, with I don't know, like Billie Eilish or something, where they have like these kind of more distinct shifts with each album, but a lot of times, and this is not to point out Billie Eilish specifically, but just in general, sometimes they kind of take after like pastiches.
I think maybe better
But
examples might be artists like Lorde potentially,
yeah,
or
yeah, that's yeah.
um,
Yeah,
who
definitely.
make these
There you
really
go.
make an effort to really kind of distinguish one album from what's come before, and that becomes a big part of their mythology.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of artists who have these eras, they do kind of take from sounds that already have been done before. But like with Homogenic specifically, I mean, can you name an album that sounded like this before this album? Like I have never heard anything like this.
Maybe super
It's
duper underground, but that's yeah, mainstream. No.
Yeah, definitely. I think here you have, I mean, this is true of her previous stuff too, but more and more, I think Björk is pulling from sources that are more obscure. She's making references to artists that are more obscure. She's pulling from these directions that not even like represent, because with post, right, and even debut, she's pulling from like aspects of techno and house and aspects of quite popular and recognizable things within the UK music scene. Whereas here, as the 90s go on, that scene sort of slowly starts to die down, and the sort of artists within that scene slowly start to get more esoteric. And as a result of that, you get Björk pulling less from popular influences and more from, you know, the more fringe aspects of that world. She starts citing influences like Stockhausen and stuff, and she starts really leaning into the avant-garde aspect of electronica. And she begins really focusing in on one of the most important collaboration of this record, which is with an artist named Mark Bell, who's a big part of the sound of this record, who designed and crafted a lot of the aesthetic and instrumentals and stuff. There were a number of collaborators relevant to that, but Mark Bell is one of the names that Björk cites as most crucial to this shift in her sound and this increasing independence as well of her vision too. So yeah, you get basically a record that sounds even less like popular music, and yet still Björk is such a compelling presence that she's able to bring the public and the people into this world with her. I mean, it wasn't as successful of a record as Post was, but it still had a distinct impression on the landscape of music. So her at this point in her career, her impact and her power in that regard still can't be denied.
I can imagine MTV, much like Post, like MTV was probably a huge part of that as well. Like it was a way to showcase her videos, which All Is Full of Love is still ranked as being one of the greatest music videos of all time.
Yeah, you have a series of videos for this record that continue to illustrate her burgeoning aesthetic and interest in art beyond music as well, and also the ways in which the video can be used to emphasize and create new ideas of aesthetics for Björk and how she can be thought of. But yeah, unlike with Post, I think most of what we think of when we think of the images and the visuals associated with Homogenic are really kind of coming back to that one singular video for All Is Full of Love. And it's like, you have like the Post videos, a lot of them were directed by Michel Gondry. I think one of the videos here is still directed by him. And that's a very specific aesthetic. Whereas here, it's 1997 and you've got the Chris Cunningham era of music videos. Like he became famous for the videos he made for Aphex Twin, right? Window Liquor and Come to Daddy. And you have him here, that connection to that electronic world as well, because Aphex Twin's obviously a huge influence on this record. That connection to that electronic world musically getting reflected in the visual aesthetic with a video for the one like the one for All Is Full of Love, which is just such a distinct and powerful and also like quite cutting edge in terms of the technology involved as well to render that vision of the robots, of the sentient love-making lesbian robots. It's really distinct and really strong, and I think radiates so much of what we associate with Björk in this era.
Beauty as well. Like you feel every bit of true, genuine love that comes from that song in that video as well. I think also what makes Björk such a compelling artist in this album, such a compelling listen, is every bit of pure raw fucking emotion that comes from it. There's a mixture of, like, take the track Hunter for instance. Like, she starts out with her angelic, raw, powerful voice, but alongside it are these vocals sung through filters and glitched and chopped and screwed up, which adds to the, not chopped and screwed, but I couldn't think of a better way to describe a chopped up, which, you know, it adds to the atmosphere of the song. Just this song about control and using power to make some of the most daring music she can, and it's that perfect, flawless mixture that really carries this album.
It's kind of it's also worth noting, like, I think largely this album is in relation to her home of Iceland, which really helps with the sound palette that she goes for on this, because she said words like volcanic to describe the beats on this thing, which are heavy, loud, huge a lot of the time. Not overly obnoxious. It's not like a Sleigh Bells record or anything, but it's very distinctly distorted, but also just so beautifully mixed in with luscious, beautiful, organic string parts all throughout.
It's very much a record of dichotomy. Like, you have as the fundamental foundation of most of the songs in this record, though not all of them, but you have as this fundamental foundation this dichotomy between often really distorted and really heavy and kind of intense beats, this sense of like the IDM influence really seeping through, and this incredibly mellow and beautiful and glacial, you know, aesthetic of these strings and of synthesizers and stuff that really provides a sharp counterpoint. And that those two elements are fundamental to the core of so much of the music on this record and the way they interrelate, and the way Björk has kind of crafted an album experience around pushing you through various avenues and then pulling you out of it and stuff. Like, there's multiple moments on this record where a song that's quite heavy and industrial and loud will just transition suddenly into something that's, you know, very beautiful and silky and atmospheric and ambient. And so Björk's really taking advantage of the album structure here to craft this journey that she's pulling you along through, this sense of up and down, of loud and quiet, of dichotomy, of her voice. And that dichotomy in instrumentation is like reflected or at least mirrored in like the way she uses her voice on this record as well, the way she reaches upward like she's so capable of doing, and the way that she also spends a lot of this record really in a lower and a kind of smoother and a sultrier atmosphere as well. It's so much happening in this record, and it's such an overwhelming sensory experience because of the way it's designed like that, to be so like polar, you know?
Yeah. And listening to this through headphones, of course, is a fucking unreal experience, because you have, again, going back to a track like Hunter, where you will just have like all of these little parts that should sound like they're a mess, but they're layered so delicately, especially with the panning of the beat from like one earbud to the other. And then you have
absolutely essential headphones record for that reason,
yes,
right? You've got to be able to take in the not even just what the mixing and the layering of stuff, but like just the way that Björk and her team are like utilizing space within mix and just really taking full advantage of the full sensory, almost three-dimensional feeling experience that music can provide. It's so, and I mean, this is not denigrate post, but compared to that record, the mixing and the sense of sound and aesthetic is so much more adventurous. Like, she's trying so much more new with how you can mix and pan and create these sonic landscapes, and it's so strongly evocative and really powerful. I mean, Hunter is a great place to start, right? Like the way in which you're kind of thrown into this very synthetic landscape straight away, and there's nothing that feels earthly in it. You have the strings that come in eventually, but even they feel tense and kind of taut, and it totally, I think, wrong foots you, I think, or at least it takes you out of whatever environment you're in, and it makes you feel that landscape that Björk's trying to convey. And it's just such an exciting beginning to any record, but to this record especially. And the way that Björk's kind of reinventing her, I've talked about all these ways that Björk's reinventing her persona, and then she just really gives you that straight away, where by kind of casting herself as this hunter who is like in seeking enlightenment, seeking ideas, seeking fulfillment, seeking love, but doing it in this aggressive way where it's like those things, those beautiful ephemeral things are her prey, like, right? And it gives it this tension that's so like, I mean, this is a record that I find like to be a really tense listening experience a lot of the time. Like there's this sustained sense of impending explosion that sometimes doesn't come, or that Björk will tease out for a really long time, and it can be discomforting at points, right?
I can't think of a better opener for an album like this. Just the way it starts with those really like tense kind of high passed synths, and then you get those stereo programmed drums that just sound incredible. Like even just that alone like sounds amazing, and the song's barely started. And I especially love like a lot of the details, and like y'all were saying about the production, the layering, to say that this is, I guess just a masterpiece in sound design. To say that it is the understatement of the century, because the thing about like arrangements and just sound design is that if you're going to add so much to each song on albums like this, then I mean, unless you're making a super loud, like, I don't know, Brave Little Abacus style record, then you got to like be kind of minimal with each part. And like every time I listen to a song like Hunter, there's something that I noticed before that I didn't. Just like to point out some little things, like her voice is filtered like throughout almost the whole thing, which gives kind of this mysterious, like tense sound to it. But like when she says just the line, "I'm a hunter," and then it sounds like natural, like there's the filter's off, and then it comes back on. I was able to get enough time and to listen to this album right before I came on, and I noticed there's accordion on this track, and I'd never heard that before. Like, and it only plays like a few notes, like occasionally, but it's perfect. Like that's all you need. And
it's very subtle.
Yeah.
There's so much like that throughout this record. And I agree. Like that's a beautiful way of describing my experience with it. Is that this record's been in my life since I was really young, and yet I still feel like I discover new secrets in it. I love the way that the sort of glitchy beats on the song, which are kind of subtle but also sort of intrusive when they happen, kind of start to stumble over themselves and almost feel like they're mutating towards the end of the song or at certain parts of the song. And just that constant presence of her like ethereal but haunting harmonized vocal that's happening in the background as well. I love that you mentioned the effects that, or the specific sort of way that her vocal is produced on this song. It is very eerie, but it's very subtle, and it gives you that sense of alien transmission, right, that I think that she's really going for. Yeah, and then that continues into Yoga, the second track on this record, which so last 2 weeks ago when we did our post video, I said that Hyperballad was my favorite Björk song, and I meant it. I really did. And I also knew equally that when we came to this record that I would end up having to eat those words. And here we are. Yoga is my favorite Björk song. We'll see if this is the last time I have to say that, but for now I feel it so deeply. And what it is, right, is that so Hyperballad's a beautiful song because it's this tender side of Björk that through the electronic aesthetic, and it's beautiful and it's gorgeous and it's just stunning. Yoga is beautiful and gorgeous and stunning, but it's also intense and fiery and crazed at certain points. There's an urgency to it, but there's also a sense of comfort. It's so emotionally all over the fucking place, this song, that it's actually really overwhelming to listen to. The way that she sings that state of emergency refrain is so like pressed and so like just intense. You get this feeling that her voice is almost going to overwhelm the technology that's being used to record it. It's so powerful. And it's the tip of the fucking iceberg.
You say iceberg, and I've literally not, for some reason, maybe it's because Iceland, but even though it's not a country of ice, I always think of an iceberg whenever I listen to this fucking album, because I don't know, there's just such a, I don't know, because like to me, icebergs are just these beautiful, beautiful things of like natural beauty and wonder. And that's what I get every time I listen to this record, at least re-listen to, because to talk about my experience with this album, if I may, I listened to this when me and a bunch of, like in a Discord server, we were listening to every Björk album. Like we had voted and Björk was the number one artist that came on top. And so we listened to every Björk album. And I had just come from Post, which was this amazing like buffet of different styles and different and places to go with experimentation. And like each song had like its own unique style to it. And while I really liked Homogenic, it didn't click with me immediately because everything felt not necessarily one note, but like everything felt like it wasn't going in those same directions as Post. And yet with every re-listen on this record, and especially a song like Yoga, I always find myself just re-listening to these songs over and over, because especially this, like, it's such a tender, beautiful song about friendship. And I love the way, because like this is about a friend of hers who was also her tour masseuse. And like she would give her massages, and there's a lyric here: every nerve that hurts, you heal deep inside of me. Like referring to not just the massage, but also every time you're here, my mental health becomes better. Every nerve that's in my brain that was feeling like garbage now is feeling better because you're here with me. And it really is just this gorgeous song about friendship and platonic love that like.
And yeah, it has this fucking corrosive beat that's just kind of steamrolling through all of that as well. And those strings, they're like almost melodramatic in how intense they are, right? That's the beautiful dichotomy of Björk here, is that she can be singing about the most tender and beautiful and meaningful and simple relationship, and she can make the intensity of her feeling sound like a fucking tidal wave. It's and that's what I mean by like genuinely overwhelming to listen to. Like one of the reasons why I wasn't so sure before I prepped for this that it was my favorite Björk song is that it's hard to fucking just throw it on. I often only listen to any of the songs on this record when I'm playing the album through, and then it just becomes, it melts into the experience so much. But fuck,
it's interesting what Jacob, you said about like this, like your first impression with this record, because mine was actually kind of the opposite, because this was actually, believe it or not, my first Björk album, because I just saw how like beloved it was, and I was like, okay, I'll try that one. And I was just so like immediately like overwhelmed by the sound design, and especially this song, because I mean the way the song starts out with the beautiful string, like it sounds cinematic, and then those drums come in, and again, like I said with Hunter, where her vocals are filtered, the drums on here have this moving like filter that's so like loud, but so like just fluid motion, like the way it's just like I just love that sound so much. And the way it almost becomes like an industrial song towards the middle section, where it gets even more distorted and hits even harder. And just I also got to talk about, like, it's such a beautiful, like, tender song, but at the same time, man, that chorus kind of, it goes hard. Like it has a genuine, like, amazing drum and bass, not this musical style drum and bass, but the actual drums and the bass groove, like the boom, doo, 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 like that's almost like, I know at least Ryley, you don't consider this to be like a trip hop album, but there's certainly like elements of trip hop in here, and I think that's like the perfect example where you have that like steady like beat with a little bit of that swing to it, and she's just singing over with these gorgeous fucking strings.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that the continued influence of trip hop and her continued influence of her relationship with Tricky can be felt on this record too. Obviously, Tricky produced multiple songs on Post, maybe the most prescient of those being Enjoy, which you can see how that sort of the sort of aesthetic of that song has kind of been more fully realized here. But also you have the fact that Björk was in a relationship with Tricky, that relationship fell apart, and there's no certainty here, but a lot of people think that the song 5 Years is written about Tricky. So there's this sense that the world of music and the world of her relationships and the world, like every aspect of what Björk is immersed in kind of coalesces here. But yeah, I think we could talk ourselves in circles if we tried to break every single song on this record down. So I want to give you guys the opportunity to shout out your favorite sort of deep cuts or your favorite tracks from this point out that you think are kind of emblematic of some aspect of the record that's really crucial or that you just really love. What are the moments on this record that really kind of bowl you over that we haven't already kind of talked about?
So my favorite song on here, which is on a 4-way tie for my favorite Björk song of all time, is the song that's unlike any other song on this record, which is Pluto. Pluto is this absolutely noisy, abrasive, glitchy, experimental masterpiece of screaming and abrasion. And it just, oh God, I feel like I'm about to word vomit. But every time I listen to this song, every time I hear those screams in the bridge, and every time I hear those ooh, ooh, ooh,
that shit gets so loud that it physically hurts to listen to.
That's what makes it amazing every time. Like, it just, like, you could play this song, like, you could sample this for, like, any experimental hip-hop band could probably sample this song for a beat, and they have, like, material for, like, an entire crowd to just mosh in.
Yeah. Totally. It's a fucking insane song. Amazing pick. Very, very great deep cut.
Gotta love that, like, 4 on the floor.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like this really sort of like stripped back. It's one of the most minimal songs on the record, but it has this sense of intensity and hugeness to it that you forget how simple it is, and you just get so caught up in how fucking abrasive it all is. That's very much the peak of the record's abrasion, alongside songs like 5 Years and Yoga to a certain extent. I'm reminded a lot, and I'm obligated to make this reference, that Ortega released Chiastic Slide in the same year as this album. There are a lot of aesthetic similarities between these two records. They very much evoke similar sorts of sonic landscapes. I know that's purely coincidental because they were probably recorded around the same time, but they have a very strong similarity and effect to me. A lot of the heavier beats here feel very reminiscent of certain tracks on that record. And also I bring this up as a way of coalescing two reference points together to talk about maybe the biggest impacts that this album had, which was on Radiohead. And Radiohead are very vocal about how influential this record is specifically on them and on the state and place they were in the wake of the OK Computer tour, trying to figure out where to go next with their sound. And of all the reference points you could make while talking about Kid A, an album that we have spent 2 hours talking about on this channel, go watch that video. The biggest, the most strongest, and most obvious reference that Tom York himself has made explicitly clear is this album. And specifically the aesthetic and the use of electronics and the way in which Björk's dedication to creating a distinct sonic environment while using the forms of popular music to create songs within that landscape is something that Radiohead would use and take in their own direction with Kid A, to the extent that I see quite stark similarities between these two records in a lot of ways, some of which I have to squint to see, but also like you can see how Motion Picture Soundtrack is very much just Radiohead trying to do their own All Is Full of Love, right down to both songs having electronic synthesized harp sounds in them. You have those sorts of little details, these sort of 10-track, concise, icy sounding records. And yeah, and that, I think my love for one very much, I think, predicts and in some ways even explains my love for the other. That's more of a of a tangent than a point related to the songs here, but it feels pertinent to mention at this point because it comes up in my head. Like I think about these records together so much.
The Radiohead thing actually speaks to a specific track on here, which is easily one of my favorite songs. And it is actually apparently Tom York's favorite song. At least he said it. I don't know when he said that. I don't know if it's changed, but the point is he said that Unravel is his favorite song, which holy shit. Oh man.
Man.
I don't know how to how do you describe the song to someone who's never heard it? Like
it is it is the sound of like beauty. Like it is just like and sadness and all of this kind of shit. Like the little like reversed sort of beautiful little sounds that'll kind of wobble through it at certain points. The way in
like
which
the glissando.
Yeah, those are so beautiful. And the way in which you have this kind of beat that sounds like submerged and ethereal and super, super subtle and low mixed. And then that you have these kind of glistening, gorgeous sort of like organy chords that are kind of hanging over the song as well, creating this kind of melancholic wallpaper for it. And then you just have Björk herself just absolutely just fucking
just one of the most emotional vocal performances I think she's ever done, easily.
So extra too. Like this is the closest the record gets to making me like overwhelmingly emotional, to be honest. The first stretch of this record, and particularly Yoga going into Unravel, I mean, that's just fucking insane levels of power, like emotionally speaking. Like you could power a small fucking nation with those songs if you could harness that emotional energy and turn it into real electricity. Like, fuck.
Yeah, a small nation such as Iceland.
Well, hey, there we go.
I had to. One more thing I wanted to say is this track actually really reminds me of what, and I assume that this was an influence on her, but it reminds me of what FKA Twigs did on Magdalene. Like a lot of that record, I think of this song and I'm like, this is why I love this as well.
If FKA Twigs as a solo artist, I think is the closest thing we have to a Björk era parent, like a direct pop star who has always been kind of carving out this niche within the world of experimental electronic music, always been working from that, been doing exciting collaborations, pushing herself. Twigs is such like the clearest distillation of Björk's influence in musical world. And it's to Twigs' credit that she both evokes that comparison so strongly, but also is such a distinct artist in her own right. Yeah, I'm glad that we got to mentioning her. One of my favorite sort of deep cut picks on this record, a song I think is super underappreciated, maybe because it's more of a sort of album track than a sort of standout piece of music in and of itself, is the song All Neon Like, which is like this sort of centerpiece, like instrumental dirgy track, I guess, in the middle of the record. It's the longest thing here. But when I sit down and listen to this record and just sort of take it in, there's so much happening texturally in this song that just fucking blows my mind. Like the distorted beat, just the sounds that are just kind of ebbing and flowing through it. Björk herself, like
Boom, 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 boom. I get stuck in my head so much.
It's so like persistent, and I used to kind of overlook this song, I think, when I was a little bit younger, but now I'm coming to realize like how much of the just kind of griminess and dirtiness of this is really kind of like festered in my brain as a particular thing that I love to hear. Like I love when you have these kind of traditional electronic beats or electronic progressions that are taken and they're just made to sound super messed up and super broken and just super compressed. It's one of the reasons why I love like Ortecker so much, but it's also like something you see in a song like this, and it's something you see in a song like 5 Years as well, which is kind of like the meeting point of a song like Bachelorette and a song like Pluto, where it takes that kind of, fiery, wronged woman doing the symphonic thing and combines it with these corrosive beats that almost feel like they're trying to tear apart the entire song. I love that melding that Björk does on so many songs here. Just so fucking good.
I don't know if I should take this point to be the contrarian crustacean, but that's the one song that has not worked for me on this record. To me, I thought other tracks kind of melded that griminess and that serene beauty much better. Especially, I think it's maybe because this has like my favorite synth tone or string tone or like instrumental tone on the record. So I am just completely lost, and it sounds like a neon sign. And then I hear the very loud do 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 do, and I'm just like, okay, this is kind of taking me out. And
well, yeah, it's definitely grown on me personally. Like it was always my least favorite, but I've kind of grown to appreciate it the more I hear it. But that's just from me.
And I think this is a great point to kind of flow into the topic of how this record can definitely have its limits for certain people. And I mentioned for forecast of this earlier, Jake, who wanted to be here, unable to join us, has passed on some extensive thoughts for me to share that I think kind of tie into this notion of being sort of at a distance from this record in a way that we're not generally, but that sometimes the record can kind of push you towards. And I'll just read what he has to say, and then we can kind of discuss and talk about how we feel about this point, whether we think there's anything that we could add to this. And then Jake says, I realize this isn't the best method to communicate a rather controversial opinion, but I'll do my best to be both brief and incisive. Homogenic's reputation and influence cannot be overstated, and I'm sure Ryley and the others have made a point to illustrate this. It's quite possibly Björk's most important album when it comes to the world of alternative music and music in general. It at least rivals something like Post or Vespertine in acclaim, and that may partially explain my relative disconnect with it, as it was the final canon Björk album I explored. And maybe it's just my overall preferences and sensibilities being what they are, but this version of Björk that blends trip hop, electronic music, and some of her earlier dance stuff is really just my least favorite version of her sound. I know this is going to be considered a hot take to basically anyone, but the timbres and textures of the instrumentals here, while good, are undeniably hindered with some relatively dated sounds that hold back the experience significantly for me. Songs that I do like on here a good deal, notably Hunter, All Neon-like, Immature, and Alarm Call, are all fundamentally solid songs that feel so distinctly rooted in this emerging cutting-edge sound that, to me, they lose something in the ways that many songs on debut did. Production quirks or song structures just tip the balancing act this album very deftly attempts to manage, and in my opinion, it doesn't always do so in a way that feels elegant. To be blunt, it feels like all the songs here are distinct experimental exercises, but they don't really cohere in a way like her following albums do into something that feels cohesive, nor do they showcase the seamless confidence and variety of something like Post. Björk as a presence is captivating as always, but her tendency to default to her vocal growling to spice up her vocal delivery feels like a trick that gets old on this record, whereas on Post, her different tonalities felt like a confident showcase of versatility. This all heavily weighs down the song 5 years the most. The tones just feel so garish, and the beat is just so clunky and awkward. The strings that pop up just don't meld into the track as seamlessly as they did on stuff on Post, as their artificiality just doesn't allow them to have the impact they need. That said, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have something like Bachelorette, which is easily the album's standout for me. Everything that can work about this album does work here, from the lyricism to the performance to the impeccable and timeless sound. If the whole album sounded as good as this, I would have no grievances whatsoever. And I've heard plenty of albums in this genre that are older that don't seem to have these issues. Seeing as I'm so divorced from the consensus, I'm sure a lot of my complaints will get the Chad yes treatment, where I'm just missing something. But I can't help but view this album in a similar light to Debut, where I understand its reputation when it comes to being a step forward for Björk and for the genre blending. But as for the music, the actual form of the work, it simply doesn't compete in the same realm as something like Vespertine, whose sound remains seamless and timeless by comparison. It's an album I would dub transitional, and unlike Post, it doesn't really have the color or variety to account for that. It's an album where I can see all the individual good parts, but when put together, I'm not transported or invigorated in the same way as I am with her other stuff, which unfortunately leads this to be my least favorite Björk record, as absurd as that possibly sounds. So here we have. I was waiting for the reaction to that last part. Here we have the hottest of takes, Jake coming out here and saying that Homogenic is his least favorite Björk album. And look, I think Jake's point, now, while I don't want to unnecessarily clown on Jake, especially when he's not here to defend himself, I do want to take Jake's point and acknowledge that it does reflect something that I think, and I've kind of touched on this already, separates this album from what's come before and definitely makes it, to some extent, kind of a love it or feel really cold on it sort of experience, which is that Björk not only is abandoning the variety of those previous records, but is leaning so hard into this aesthetic, going so deep down the rabbit hole here that it is going to be polarizing to a certain extent. It is going to feel like a strange and uncomfortable and almost like unfriendly and unwelcoming journey to a certain extent. Like, I think Björk would be kind of pleased to hear Jake's response with how hard she very much tries to go down this route of I will fucking murder you as a persona and as a musical aesthetic on this album. Like, she's wanting to chew people up and swallow them, chew up whatever you wanted her to be and spit it out. And though she would go on to make records that resonate with Jake a lot more than this, I think what Jake perceives in this speaks to Björk's desire in this particular era to just be held up in a light of confusion and of bewilderment and of distance. I think this is a necessary step for Björk to distance herself from previous versions of herself, from the media who portray and see her in a particular light, and maybe even from music in general, from the world of music that she exists in. And I think the album's interesting as a curio when viewed in that light as well. And given a different cultural context, potentially this could have been an album that completely flopped or didn't have the success it had at all. It's an interesting example of an artist seemingly self-sabotaging, and yet through that process, connecting to more people than ever before. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I definitely understand how this can definitely leave a lot of folks cold, especially even Björk fans, especially as she would even continue to get even wilder than this. That maybe this does sound like something that maybe somebody can be a bit cold on. And
do you agree with the notion? Do you think that she's self-sabotaging with this album? Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you think she's trying to welcome a new audience in? Like, what do you think of that notion of what Björk is trying to do metatextually with Homogenic?
I could honestly, I hate to chicken out of this, but I can see both, because I don't know if she definitely is leaning harder into it and maybe kind of abandoning the variety that she had, which could give you radio hits. But again, her image and her weirdness, so to say, again, going back to the MTV thing, I think that is also what kept her fully running forward, steam train ahead forward, because with the music that maybe she could alienate audiences with the visuals, she could embrace an entirely new audience who wanted more things like this, who wanted those videos, who could, spend all day waiting 30 minutes for the Björk videos to come on with the weird dollhouse and with the two weird robots and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I could see both happening in that sort of way.
What do you think, Connor?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if this necessarily answers the question, but I feel like she's just trying to just completely come into her own by doing something that she's never done before. And in a way, she is reinventing what Björk is into almost like a more uniform style. Although I would argue that even though it's definitely not as, I guess, eclectic as something like Post in terms of song to song, I would say that I think all these songs are quite different and distinct from each other. I will say I do really like how Jake mentioned Bachelorette, because that is also just that first 4-track run is just ridiculous. But I think that song, that's a great, like, if you wanted to show someone, if someone was like, went up to you and was like, oh, give me just one homogenic song to check out for, then that would be a great choice. I think either that or yoga.
Yeah, I think the most radio friendly songs here are Bachelorette and Alarm Call. And
Alarm Call, yeah.
Even then, those songs have elements to them that feel like Björk is deliberately trying to be unfriendly. Like the whole vibe and tone of Bachelorette, the lyricism in the sense that Björk is this kind of threatening figure. And then with Alarm Call, it's like she's almost trying to empower the listener, but it's also in a way that's really kind of quite aggressive. And she has those beep, 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 beep vocal hooks that I get stuck in my head all the time. And it's very like instrumentally, it's a little bit more sort of in your face for a pop song. So like every crumb it feels like that Björk's giving the audience comes equally with a sense of fuck off. It very much feels like this is why I emphasize the Ricardo Lopez thing, because while I don't want to read too much into that, it feels very much like Björk is deliberately trying to offend the sensibilities and ward off as many people who might have seen her in a particular light or become attracted to her for a particular thing as possible. And it's meaningful, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Vespertine, but I think it's meaningful the way that Björk essentially does the inverse of this record on her next record. And you see her kind of reacting against this as well in terms of the way that she casts herself, because Vespertines are a record that's fundamentally about vulnerability and sensuality. And this is a record that is fundamentally about the opposite of those things. Like it's about not whatever the opposite of vulnerability, strength, I guess. It's about gritty attack, and it's about seizing power in a lot of ways, which I think makes the decision to end with "All Is Full of Love" quite curious as well. It's this hopeful sense that there is a way out of the darkness, I suppose, but also a sense that, if you feel a certain sense of isolation, that maybe you've brought that on yourself. All is full of love, you just ain't receiving. Like it's kind of a mean-spirited Björk, as beautiful as the song is. And that, again, coming back to the idea of dichotomies, the pretty and the beautiful and the ugly is what Björk is all about here. It's you never know exactly where you stand listening to a record like Homogenic. And that, to me, is what makes it so compelling, is you can never fully be sure of where you are. And that will either lead you to fall into the fucking vortex and just let yourself be battered around by the hurricane Björk, or you tune out and you decide to move on to the next thing. And I think Björk deliberately designed the record in that way.
If I may add one more thing, track 3 is called Unravel. And to be honest, unravel is the word if I had to describe this album in one word, it would be unravel, because every listen, you are discovering new things. It is always unraveling itself to you.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Trademark Sanchez bit of bringing it back to the wordplay there. Love it. Let's do our favorite tracks and ratings then for Björk's Homogenic. I'll read Jake's first. Jake's 3 favorite tracks are Bachelorette, Pluto, and All Is Full of Love. Jake's least favorite is 5 Years, and Jake gives it a 7 out of 10, which I think is honestly pretty generous considering what he said.
Yeah. It almost read like a 5, to be honest.
I don't have any info from August, but I know that this is an August core 9 out of 10 record. So I'll put that down on the spreadsheet as well. I don't think Morgan's heard this, so that sounds like a Morgan problem. As for me, my 3 favorite tracks are going to be Yoga, Unravel for sure, and I'll say Bachelorette. I think just that 3-track run, I think, is it for me, weirdly enough. Least favorite track, I don't really have one. I just think, because if I were to take in even the track I would rank lowest out of this, it would kind of completely upset the balance of the record. And I'm giving this a 10. Like I decided yesterday, it's a 10. I've wavered. It's a 10. It's one of the records that most fundamentally shaped my taste in music ever since I was a child, and it'll always be that. So yeah, it's a 10 for me.
So my three favorites, you know what? I think the same as you, Ryley, in the same order. So Yoga, Unravel, and Bachelorette. Although Hunter could swap out with Bachelorette, but no, I'll go with Bachelorette. Least favorite, All Neon Like, if I had to pick one, but I still love it, you know. And I had this for a long time at a 9.5 because I always thought that the first half was just so unbelievably flawless that the second half didn't quite live up there. But when I was listening to this last night and kind of reflecting on my history with this album, because I'd, like you, Ryley, I'd heard this album like so long ago, like years ago. But one thing I forgot to say is that this album was like so influential to me in terms of styles of music that I never thought I would be into, including like art pop and, you know, trip hop, experimental electronic, all that stuff, IDM. Like I wasn't even into any of that until this. So because of that, this gets a 10.
Well, hey, there we go. It's a big deal. A Connor 10. Here we go. Jacob.
My three favorite tracks. My favorite is Pluto. And then after that, I'm going to say Yoga. And then after that, I am going to go with Hunter. And my least favorite track is All Neon Like. And I'm sorry to upset the balance. This gets a 9 out of 10.
That's fine.
Fantastic record.
You have absolutely not upset the balance. That means that Homogenic gets a 9.0 average across every member of this podcast and podcast family who has listened to it. Let us know at home what you think of Homogenic, what Homogenic means to you, how you feel it ranks in the Björk discography. We've had some really wonderful commenters who've been sticking around for our Björk video so far. I know we've only had 2 of them, but we're really looking forward to hearing from you again. So hit us up down in the comments, or if you haven't commented before, it's never too late to start. So hit us up, let us know what you think, let us know what the record means to you, favorite tracks, your impressions on our thoughts and some of the things that we've said. We want to hear from you in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Both of those things help us out and make it possible to make these Björk videos. If you want to support the channel even further and get your name featured in every video on this channel, as well as getting priority comment response, and if you want to recommend us some music to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile, then hit the join button, and it only costs you $1 a month to get entitled to those perks. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Microsoft. B, what's next?